You know that moment when your own daughter stands up at her wedding reception and decides to roast you in front of 200 guests? Well, that happened to me. But what happened next? Let's just say the room went from laughing at me to complete silence in about 30 seconds. Picture this: beautiful wedding venue, crystal chandeliers, everyone dressed to the nines. My daughter Rachel looked absolutely stunning in her white gown, and I was so proud watching her marry the love of her life. The reception was going perfectly until she grabbed the microphone for what I thought would be a sweet thank you speech. Instead, she smiled at the crowd and said, "I want to talk about my mom for a minute. She's going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis." The room chuckled. At 60, she decided she wants to build an empire. She actually used finger quotes, and the laughter got louder. We keep telling her she should act her age, but she won't listen. I sat there smiling, dying inside as 200 people laughed at my so-called midlife crisis. But here's what none of them knew, including my own daughter. While they were all mocking the crazy old lady trying to play entrepreneur, the most powerful person in that room was sitting quietly at table 6. Because you see, what happened next involved Rachel's new husband's boss standing up, nearly choking on his champagne while looking at me in shock and saying 5 words that changed everything. But to understand how my daughter's wedding turned into the most satisfying moment of vindication in my entire life, I need to take you back 2 years to when this whole thing started. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Never Too Old channel. We're creating a community of incredible people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the story. 2 years earlier, I was Diana Thompson, 60 years old, recently divorced, and honestly feeling pretty lost. After 30 years working as an office manager, I'd been laid off when the company restructured, which, let's be honest, usually means they replaced older employees with younger, cheaper ones. For the first time in decades, I was truly on my own. Rachel was 32 and living with her fiancé Jake. My ex-husband had remarried someone 15 years younger, because apparently that's what men do during their actual midlife crises. And there I was, sitting in my small apartment, wondering what the heck I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. But here's the thing about being 60 and suddenly unemployed. You have 2 choices. You can either accept that your best years are behind you, or you can decide that all those years of experience might actually be worth something. I chose option 2. I started a consulting business, helping small companies with their operations and efficiency. Nothing glamorous, just using the skills I developed over 3 decades of keeping offices running smoothly. I called it DT Enterprises, simple, professional, and it kept my personal name out of it. The problem was, nobody in my family took it seriously. Rachel would roll her eyes whenever I mentioned a new client. "Mom, you're 60, not 23. Maybe it's time to act your age," she'd say. Jake was even worse, constantly trying to mansplain basic business concepts to me like I was a child playing dress-up. "Have you considered finding a normal job instead of this entrepreneur phase?" my sister would ask during family dinners. "Diana, you missed your chance. Just accept it and find something stable." Even my friends meant well, but their comments stung. "It's cute that you're trying," they'd say. "But realistically, how much can you really accomplish starting over at your age?" The worst part was that I was actually good at what I was doing. Really good. My clients were thriving, my contracts were growing, and I was making more money than I ever had as an office manager. But every time I tried to share a success with my family, they'd pat me on the head like I was a toddler who'd managed to tie her shoes. Rachel was planning her wedding during this time, and she made it very clear that she didn't want me talking about my little business to Jake's colleagues who would be attending. "Please don't embarrass me by telling people you're an entrepreneur," she said. "Just say you're between jobs or something." I agreed because I loved my daughter and wanted her wedding day to be perfect. But sitting there listening to her friends make jokes about my midlife crisis while I quietly paid for half the wedding expenses they didn't even know about, I started to realize something. My family wasn't just unsupportive, they were actively ashamed of me for refusing to fade quietly into middle-aged invisibility, and that hurt more than any layoff ever could. The wedding day arrived, and it was absolutely beautiful. Rachel had chosen this gorgeous venue with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a garden. I'd helped pay for quite a bit of it, actually, though she just assumed the money came from my divorce settlement rather than my thriving business. I dressed carefully that morning, nice but not too flashy, elegant but not attention-grabbing. The last thing I wanted was to upstage the bride on her special day. Rachel had specifically asked me not to mention my consulting work to Jake's colleagues who would be attending, and I'd promised to keep quiet about my success. "Just blend in, Mom," she'd said during the rehearsal dinner. "Jake's boss, Mr. Anderson, will be there with his wife, plus a bunch of people from his tech company. These are serious business people, so please don't go on about your little projects." I bit my tongue and nodded. Little projects, right. The ceremony was perfect. Rachel looked like a princess. Jake seemed genuinely happy, and I cried happy tears watching my daughter start this new chapter. During the cocktail hour, I mingled quietly, making small talk with other family members and staying well away from Jake's work crowd. But I couldn't help overhearing some of their conversations. These tech company people were discussing business deals, market strategies, recent acquisitions in their industry. I knew more about their sector than they probably realized, but I kept my mouth shut and smiled politely when introduced as the bride's mother. Then came dinner, and everything was going smoothly until Rachel's maid of honor decided to give a speech. She started sweet, talking about their friendship and how beautiful the wedding was. But then she shifted gears. "Now I have to talk about the bride's family," she said with a grin. "Especially Rachel's mom, who's been quite the character lately." The room chuckled, and I felt my stomach drop. "Diana's going through what I guess you'd call a late-life crisis," she continued, and the laughter got louder. "At 60, she decided she wants to build an empire. She actually used finger quotes, and I wanted to disappear under the table. We keep telling her she should act her age, but she won't listen. She's trying to compete with people half her age in business." More laughter, but hey, at least she's keeping busy instead of just gardening like normal moms her age, right? The whole room was laughing now. 200 people, all enjoying a good joke at my expense. I sat there with a frozen smile, my cheeks burning with humiliation, as Rachel's friend continued her roast. "We love our delusional mom anyway," she finished to applause and more laughter. But the worst part wasn't the maid of honor's speech. The worst part was watching Rachel's face during it. She wasn't embarrassed or trying to stop it. She was laughing too, nodding along like this was all perfectly acceptable. When the maid of honor sat down, Rachel stood up to give her own speech. I thought maybe she'd balance things out, say something nice about me. Instead, she doubled down. "Thanks for that, Amy." "Yes, my mom has definitely been on an adventure lately," Rachel said into the microphone. "She keeps insisting she's building a business empire, but we're just trying to get her to accept that some dreams have expiration dates. When you're over 60, maybe it's time to be realistic about what you can actually accomplish." The room erupted in laughter again. Jake's colleagues were practically in tears. Mr. Anderson was shaking his head with an amused smile. Even the servers seemed to be trying not to laugh as they collected dinner plates. I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear. But most of all, I wanted my daughter to stop publicly humiliating me on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of both our lives. "But we support Mom's hobby anyway," Rachel continued, "even if it means listening to her talk about client meetings and business strategies like she's some kind of CEO. The way she said it, with such dismissive mockery, finally broke something inside me. This wasn't just unsupportive, this was cruel. And it was happening in front of everyone who mattered to her new husband's career, people who could have been valuable connections for my actual business if they'd known the truth. As Rachel finished her speech to thunderous applause, I felt completely defeated. This wasn't just unsupportive, this was cruel, and it was happening in front of everyone who mattered to her new husband's career. I decided I'd had enough humiliation for one evening. I would quietly slip out after dinner, maybe make an excuse about not feeling well. The last thing I wanted was to cause any more drama on Rachel's special day. even though my heart was completely broken. After Rachel's speech, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. People started approaching my table with the kind of patronizing sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Good for you for trying something new at your age," one of Jake's aunts said, patting my shoulder like I was a brave little girl who'd attempted to ride a bicycle. "It's never too late to chase dreams, even small ones," added another guest with a condescending smile. My neighbor started selling jewelry at 60, made almost $300 last year. Jake's colleagues were even worse. When someone introduced me as the bride's entrepreneurial mother, they'd nod politely and immediately change the subject. I could practically see them thinking, "Oh, another middle-aged woman with a cute little side hustle." One of them actually said, "That's wonderful. My mother-in-law started making crafts on Etsy. It keeps her busy," like I was some kind of charity case who needed hobbies to fill my empty days. But the absolute worst moment came when Jake pulled me aside during the cocktail hour. "Diana, thanks for being such a good sport about the speeches," he said. "I know Rachel was just having fun, but I didn't want you to feel bad about your consulting thing." "My consulting thing?" I repeated. "Yeah, I mean, it's great that you're staying active and trying new things, but I hope you're not putting too much pressure on yourself to make it into something big. At your age, it's really more about staying engaged than actually building a career, right?" I stared at him. This was my son-in-law. This was the man my daughter had chosen to spend her life with, and he was basically telling me to know my place. "Jake," I said carefully, "what exactly do you think I do?" He shrugged. "Some kind of small business consulting? Rachel mentioned you help local shops with their paperwork or something, which is nice. Every little bit helps when you're starting over later in life." Local shops, paperwork, starting over later in life. I nodded and excused myself to the restroom, where I sat in a stall and tried not to cry. My own family thought I was some kind of amateur playing at business. They had no idea that in the past 18 months I'd acquired 6 companies. 6, including a major tech firm that was probably worth more than everything Jake would earn in his entire career. When I came back out, I heard Rachel talking to one of her bridesmaids near the bar. "Poor mom," Rachel was saying. "She's been so lost since the divorce. This whole business thing is just her way of feeling important again. We don't have the heart to tell her it's never going to be anything real." "That's so sad," her friend replied. "But at least she's keeping busy instead of becoming one of those depressing empty nest moms who calls their kids every day." Exactly. And honestly, I'd rather have her playing entrepreneur than dating again. Can you imagine? They both laughed, and something inside me just broke. This wasn't just about being underestimated anymore. My own daughter genuinely believed I was a pathetic middle-aged woman desperately grasping for relevance. She thought my success was make-believe, my ambitions were delusional, and my accomplishments were just sad attempts to feel important. The irony was devastating. While Rachel was worrying about me becoming a depressing empty nest mom, I knew the truth about what I'd actually built. While she was embarrassed to have her colleagues meet her entrepreneurial mother, that same mother had accomplished more than anyone else in the room realized. I made it through dinner, smiling and nodding as more people offered their well-meaning but insulting advice about realistic expectations for women my age. I was planning to slip out quietly after the cake cutting, maybe fake a headache and leave the newlyweds to enjoy their party. But then something happened that I definitely wasn't expecting. During the after-dinner socializing, Mr. Anderson approached me. I'd been trying to avoid Jake's boss all evening, not wanting to endure another conversation about my cute little consulting hobby. "Mrs. Thompson," he said politely, "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Robert Anderson, Jake's supervisor at Sterling Tech." Sterling Tech. My heart nearly stopped. "It's Miss Thompson, actually," I managed to say. "And yes, I know who you are." He smiled. "Jake mentioned you're in business consulting. That's wonderful. What kind of work do you do?" I looked at Robert Anderson, this polite man who had no idea what was about to happen, and I realized this conversation was going to be very interesting indeed. "Well, Mr. Anderson," I said carefully, "I work in acquisitions and operational consulting. I help companies optimize their efficiency and growth potential. He nodded politely. That sounds fascinating. Mostly with small local businesses, I imagine. Actually, I focus on mid-sized companies in the tech sector, I replied. Firms that are ready to scale but need strategic guidance and capital investment. His eyebrows raised slightly. Really? That's quite specialized. How long have you been in that field? About 2 years, seriously, though I've been building toward it for years. Impressive, he said, though I could tell he still thought I was talking about much smaller deals than I actually handled. Have you worked with any companies I might know? I paused. This was the moment where I could either continue deflecting or be honest. After everything that had happened tonight, I was tired of hiding. Actually, yes. I recently completed an acquisition of Sterling Technologies. The change in his expression was immediate and dramatic. His polite smile froze, then slowly faded as his eyes widened. Sterling Technologies. Yes, the acquisition closed about 3 months ago. He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched as the pieces clicked into place in his mind. Wait a minute. Sterling Technologies was acquired by DT Enterprises. His voice was getting quieter. You're not saying, I'm D. Thompson, yes. The color drained from his face. You're the D. Thompson? The D. Thompson who acquired Sterling. That would be me. He nearly dropped his champagne glass. Oh my God, I had no idea. I mean, when Jake said his mother-in-law was in consulting, I never imagined. He was stammering now, completely flustered. Miss Thompson, I am so sorry. If I had known. It's fine, Mr. Anderson. I deliberately keep a low profile. But he wasn't fine. He was clearly panicking, running his hand through his hair. Ma'am, I need to apologize for this entire evening. The way people have been talking to you, treating you like… He looked around the room where people were still making jokes about my hobby business. This is mortifying. Mr. Anderson, please don't worry about it. I chose not to correct anyone. But you shouldn't have had to. Do you realize that half the people in this room work for companies in your portfolio? The way they've been talking about your little consulting business when you literally own… He stopped, shaking his head in disbelief. That's when I realized he was right. Looking around the room, I could see executives from 3 different companies I'd acquired in the past year. They'd all been treating me like a sweet, delusional middle-aged woman playing at business. Mr. Anderson, I said quietly, I really don't want to make a scene. This is my daughter's wedding day. But he was too shocked to let it go. Ma'am, with all due respect, people need to know. The way your own family has been… do they have any idea what you've accomplished? No, I admitted. They don't. He stared at me incredulously. Your daughter doesn't know that her mother is one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry? She thinks I have a small consulting business helping local shops with paperwork. Local shops? His voice rose slightly, then he caught himself and lowered it again. Miss Thompson, you've acquired 6 companies in 18 months. You're running a $50 million portfolio. You're not just successful, you're a powerhouse in the sector. I could see other people starting to notice our intense conversation. Jake was glancing over with a curious expression, probably wondering why his boss was talking so seriously with his hobby entrepreneur mother-in-law. Mr. Anderson, please, I said. I really don't want to take attention away from Rachel and Jake tonight. But I could see the internal struggle on his face. As a business professional, he was clearly horrified by how I'd been treated. As someone who worked in an industry where reputation and respect mattered enormously, he couldn't stand watching me be dismissed and mocked. I understand your concern for your daughter, he said finally, but Ms. Thompson, what's happening here isn't right. These people don't just owe you respect as a person, they owe you respect as their boss. Their boss? Jake works for Sterling Technologies, which you now own. The Hendersons over there? They work for Quantum Solutions, you acquired that in January. The Patel couple? Dataflow Systems, that was your March acquisition. He gestured around the room. Half of these people's paychecks ultimately come from companies you control, and they're making jokes about your midlife crisis. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Here was proof that I'd built something significant, something that mattered, but it also highlighted just how completely my own family had misjudged and underestimated me. What's really disturbing, Anderson continued, is that your daughter's speech essentially mocked you for having unrealistic business ambitions, but you haven't been unrealistic at all. You've been incredibly successful. She just doesn't know it. Jake was definitely watching us now, and he started walking over. "Everything okay here?" he asked with a slightly nervous smile. "You two seem to be having quite an intense conversation." Anderson looked at me, clearly asking permission with his eyes. I nodded slightly. I was tired of hiding. "Jake," Anderson said carefully, "I was just learning more about your mother-in-law's consulting business." "Oh, that," Jake said with a dismissive chuckle. "Yeah, Diana's been trying her hand at the business world. It's actually pretty cute how seriously she takes it." The look of horror that crossed Anderson's face was almost comical. "Cute?" he repeated. "Well, you know how it is when people start over later in life. You have to encourage them even if their goals are a bit optimistic." Jake patted my shoulder condescendingly. "But we support Diana's little venture, don't we, Mom?" Anderson stared at Jake like he'd just watched someone insult the president to their face without realizing who they were talking to. "Jake," Anderson said slowly, "I don't think you understand who you're talking about." "What do you mean?" Anderson looked at me one more time and I gave him another small nod. The cat was about to be out of the bag. "Your mother-in-law isn't playing at business, Jake. She is business. Diana Thompson is D. Thompson of DT Enterprises. She owns Sterling Technologies. She owns the company we work for." Jake's face went completely blank. "What?" "She's not a small-time consultant helping local shops. She's acquired 6 major companies in the past 18 months, including ours. Jake, your mother-in-law is your boss's boss's boss." The moment when Jake's brain finally processed what Anderson was saying was like watching someone get hit by a truck in slow motion. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. "That's," Jake finally managed, "that's impossible. She drives an old Honda. She lives in a small apartment. She deliberately maintains a modest lifestyle," Anderson finished. "A lot of serious investors do that. It keeps them focused on business rather than lifestyle inflation." Other people were starting to notice that something significant was happening. The conversation had drawn attention, and I could see curious faces turning our way. Anderson seemed to realize that the secret was well and truly out now. And honestly, after the evening I'd had, I wasn't entirely upset about it. "You know what?" Anderson said, his voice getting slightly louder. "I think people should know this." And before I could stop him, he was walking toward the microphone. "Excuse me, everyone," Anderson said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the entire reception hall. "I'm sorry to interrupt the festivities, but I need to share something remarkable that I just discovered." The music stopped. All conversation ceased. 200 people turned to look at him with curious expressions. I wanted to disappear under the table, but it was too late now. "Ladies and gentlemen, I just had the most enlightening conversation with the mother of the bride," Anderson continued. "I need to apologize to everyone here, and especially to Ms. Diana Thompson, for a serious misunderstanding." Rachel was staring at Anderson with confusion, probably wondering why her new husband's boss was talking about me at her wedding reception. "You see, we've all been treating Ms. Thompson as if she were some kind of amateur dabbling in business as a hobby. We've been patronizing her, dismissing her accomplishments, and frankly, we've been incredibly rude." The room was dead silent now. I could feel every eye in the place turning toward me. "What we didn't realize," Anderson's voice grew stronger, "is that Diana Thompson is actually D. Thompson, the founder and CEO of DT Enterprises. She's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in our industry." Gasps echoed around the room. Someone dropped a fork. I heard Rachel make a small choking sound. "In the past 18 months alone, Ms. Thompson has acquired 6 major companies, including Sterling Technologies, where I work as Chief Operating Officer." Anderson's voice carried a note of amazement. She's built a $50 million business portfolio while we've all been treating her like she was playing dress-up. The silence was deafening. Then all hell broke loose. What? Rachel shrieked, loud enough that everyone in the room heard her. People started talking all at once. I saw the Hendersons frantically whispering to each other. They'd been among the most condescending about my cute little business. The Patels looked like they'd seen a ghost. Jake was still standing there with his mouth hanging open like a fish. Furthermore, Anderson continued, clearly on a roll now, I need to point out that roughly half the people in this room actually work for companies that Ms. Thompson now owns. So when we've been making jokes about her unrealistic business dreams, we've essentially been mocking our own boss. That's when the real panic set in. I watched executives and employees frantically trying to remember every dismissive comment they'd made to me throughout the evening. The man who'd compared me to his crafting aunt looked like he was about to be sick. Rachel was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete shock mixed with something that might have been horror. "Mom," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise, "is this true?" Before I could answer, Anderson spoke again. "I think Miss Thompson should be the one to respond to that question." He handed me the microphone. 200 people fell silent again, all waiting for my response. This was definitely not how I'd planned to spend my daughter's wedding reception. "Well," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "yes, it's true. I am Dee Thompson of DT Enterprises." The room erupted again, but I kept talking. "I know this comes as a surprise to many of you, especially my family. I've deliberately kept a low profile because I prefer to let my work speak for itself rather than seeking publicity or recognition." I looked directly at Rachel, who was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. "Honey, I didn't tell you because you specifically asked me not to talk about my business tonight. You were embarrassed by what you thought was my little consulting hobby, so I respected your wishes and stayed quiet." "But Mom," Rachel's voice was tiny now, "you said you were doing small business consulting." "I never said small business consulting. I said business consulting. You assumed it was small because—" I paused, trying to find a diplomatic way to say this. "Because you thought I was too old and inexperienced to accomplish anything significant." The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. "When you gave your speech earlier about my late-life crisis and how I should act my age, you were talking about a business that employs over 400 people across 6 companies. I kept my voice gentle but clear. When you said I was being unrealistic about what I could accomplish, you were referring to accomplishments that have already happened." Jake finally found his voice. "Diana, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for everything I said. I feel like such an idiot." "Jake, you assumed that a woman my age couldn't possibly know more about business than you do. That's worth thinking about." But the person I was really watching was Rachel. My daughter looked absolutely devastated, and not in a good way. She wasn't proud or excited about my success. She looked mortified that she'd been so wrong, so publicly. "Mom," she said quietly, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because every time I tried to share good news about my business, you'd roll your eyes and change the subject. You told me I was having a midlife crisis. You said some dreams have expiration dates. You asked me not to embarrass you by talking about my work to your fiancé's colleagues." I gestured around the room, many of whom, as it turns out, now work for me. The implications of that were starting to sink in around the room. I could see people frantically trying to remember if they'd said anything particularly offensive about the delusional old lady and her business fantasies. Anderson stepped forward again. "If I may add something," he said, "Miss Thompson has been incredibly gracious about tonight's misunderstandings. A lesser person might have been deeply offended by some of the comments that were made." Rachel's maid of honor, who had started the whole thing with her speech about my late-life crisis, looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor. "But what I find most impressive," Anderson continued, "is that Ms. Thompson was willing to endure public mockery rather than upstage her daughter's wedding with news of her business success. That shows remarkable character and love for her family." Now Rachel really looked like she was going to cry, but not from happiness. "So," I said into the microphone, "I hope you'll all forgive the dramatic revelation. This wasn't how I planned to spend the evening, but sometimes the truth has a way of coming out. I looked at Rachel with all the love I could muster, and now let's get back to celebrating this beautiful couple and their future together. I handed the microphone back to Anderson and sat down. The room gradually returned to normal conversation levels, but everything had changed. People who had been patronizing me all evening were now approaching with very different attitudes. "Ms. Thompson," said the man who had compared me to his crafting aunt, "I owe you a huge apology. I had no idea. If I had known—" "It's fine," I told him. "Really." But it wasn't fine for Rachel. As the evening wound down, I could see her struggling with the reality of how wrong she'd been about her own mother. When she finally approached me, her eyes were red. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I feel terrible about everything. The speech, the way I've been treating your work, all of it." "Rachel, honey, it's your wedding day. Let's not let this spoil it." "But I was so awful to you, in front of everyone, and you just sat there and took it because you didn't want to ruin my day." She was crying now. What kind of daughter does that make me? What kind of daughter? The kind who was more worried about being embarrassed by me than understanding who I actually am. "Rachel, you stood up in front of 200 people and mocked me for refusing to act my age. You told everyone my dreams had expiration dates. That's not just a mistake, that's cruel." I kept my voice steady but firm. "You weren't just wrong about the facts. You were willing to humiliate me publicly rather than support me. We have a lot to work through before things can go back to normal." As Jake and Rachel left for their honeymoon the next morning, I could tell this revelation was going to change our family dynamics significantly. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. After all, I was 62 years old, and I had finally stopped letting other people tell me what I was too old to accomplish. 6 months after the wedding, things had changed in ways I never expected. Jake started calling me Miss Thompson at family dinners and actually asking for my business advice. Turned out he was much more respectful when he realized his job security depended on staying in my good graces. Funny how that works. My sister stopped giving me lectures about realistic expectations and started bragging to her friends about her successful entrepreneur sister. Amazing how quickly people's tune changes when success becomes undeniable. Rachel and I? Well, that took longer to repair. She came back from her honeymoon expecting things to go back to normal, but I held firm to my boundaries. We started family therapy. Yes, at 62, I dragged my 34-year-old daughter to counseling. Turns out, being a powerful businesswoman means you don't have to accept being treated poorly by anyone, including family. The best part? 3 of my wedding guests approached me afterward about consulting contracts. Apparently, being publicly revealed as a business powerhouse is excellent marketing. Who knew? And Mr. Anderson? He became one of my most trusted executives. Sometimes the best business relationships start with champagne and complete shock. These days, when people ask about my late-life career change, I just smile. Because at 62, I've learned the most important business lesson of all. Never underestimate a woman who's decided she's done being underestimated. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Was Rachel's public embarrassment at her own wedding justified payback, or should I have handled the revelation differently? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.